Well, welcome and good afternoon. Welcome to our session on measuring the impact of revitalization. My name is Victor Rubin. I'm the Vice President for Research at PolicyLink in Oakland, California. And I've had the pleasure of working with Keith Waldrop of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia and the other colleagues who put the conference together to put together what we hope and are confident will be a very lively discussion about how we begin to understand the consequences of the types of actions that we've been hearing about at the conference so far, how we begin to measure impact, how we begin to understand what changes are taking place in the communities, the cities, and even the regions with which we are concerned here. I want to introduce our panelists, tell you about a late change, describe how we're going to use our time today, and then get right into it. We have here Scott Hebert, Principal Associate of Community Science, and Scott will be our first speaker. And Scott will lay out some of the ways in which we can think systematically about revitalization and the equity impacts, the consequences for different populations and different types of neighborhoods, of the sorts of investments in older industrial cities that we've been hearing about in the conference. We're going to hear from Sophie Dagenais. Sophie is the director of the Baltimore Civic site for the Annie Casey Foundation. That means not only a deep concentration on the East Baltimore revitalization initiative, but a whole range of strategies and initiatives and investments that the Annie Casey Foundation, based in Baltimore, makes around the city and around the region. And as such, she's been involved lately and for quite some time in trying to begin to answer this question of how would we measure the impacts of our investments, not just the foundation, but the investments writ large to create a post-industrial future for Baltimore, an equitable post-industrial future. Kurt Metzger is not here today. A family medical emergency has kept him away. Kurt is the Director Emeritus of Data-Driven Detroit, or D3 as it's known. And we can't replace him with as much knowledge about Detroit or as much discussion of Detroit, although having spent a fair amount of time there myself and working with Kurt and many others over the last few years, well, I'm sure we'll bring it up in the conversation. But we've been joined by Manuel Pastor. And if you were here yesterday at the start of the conference, you heard Manuel as part of our opening plenary session. And Manuel has a very long title, which I'll probably mess up if I attempt to get all of it. But he is a professor of Sociology and American Studies at the University of Southern California, where he also directs the program on environmental and regional equity and co-directs the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. Fairly close, yeah, fairly close. A wide range of interests, which he addresses through a variety of data projects. I'm not going to say big data in quite the way that Raj Chetty said yesterday, but big enough data to give us remarkable profiles of metropolitan regions, where they are, and hints of where they're going with respect to economic vitality in the light of demographic change. He's going to talk a little about this Regional Equity Profiles project, which PEER, the Program on Environmental Regional Equity, does in conjunction with PolicyLink. And so we can begin a discussion there, too, as with Sophie and Scott, of what these conditions mean at the start for equity and what would have to change if we were to be measuring progress towards a more equitable economy, a more inclusive economy. Now, we had set this up, of course, with Kurt, where we had an original plan that Scott's presentation will come first. He has a PowerPoint to accompany his comments and the framework that he's going to lay out. And then Sophie and Kurt were going to talk for about 5 minutes to introduce their work, and then we would engage in a discussion among the panelists of several questions that we've been talking about among ourselves online for the last few weeks. We'll amend that slightly. Sophie will still follow Scott, and then Manuel will make a brief presentation of the regional equity profiles, not so much that you can understand all of the depth of it because it is a massive project. But you can get a feel for how things are measured, what's important, what some of the uses might be. And he'll use the Kansas City profile as an example there, one which has a lot of similarities to the older industrial cities that we're talking about here in this conference. And then we will proceed through that discussion among the four of us of some of the key questions about jobs and business development, questions about neighborhood change, because a lot of the questions of how you measure impact of revitalization are about individual people and families and their livelihoods, but a lot of other ones, of course, are about the nature of communities. Who gets to live in the revived city? Where do people go? How do they fit into the fabric of a rebuilt and reconceptualized city? And this takes us then to a discussion of regions and where are people living and what is the changing nature of communities throughout metropolitan regions. And then we'll talk a little about the business of getting access to this data and how this kind of research can be conducted and where these indicators come from and how they can be carried out, how the work with them can be carried out in an equitable way. We'll leave time, to be sure, for your questions and comments after that discussion among the panelists. So with great thanks to everyone for their time in putting this together and their patience and flexibility as we make a few of these changes, we'll ask Scott to come up and begin our conversation. Scott Hebert.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Victor. Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation is going to discuss considerations in assessing equitable revitalization, and the real purpose of my presentation is really set up the discussion for the whole panel. And this conference is about reinventing older cities, and as part of that is thinking about revitalization in older communities, which is really about either restoring or increasing prosperity. And there's lots of very tough questions about how do you accomplish that. And the sessions over the 3 days of this conference are really addressing that. But there's also a key question about, well, who's going to benefit from that prosperity if you achieve the prosperity? And that's really the central concern when you're looking at equitable revitalization. And to set a context, I'm going to introduce a working definition of equitable revitalization so we all know what we're trying to discuss here. And I also, in doing so, in sharing this definition, I want to credit the Center for Community Progress, I used a lot of their materials in sort of putting together this definition. And equitable revitalization is revitalization to the extent feasible, follows a process that both engages and benefits community members at all income levels, ages, and racial and ethnic backgrounds. And by community members, we mean not only the owners and the renters of housing, but also local business owners and operators and the local nonprofits and the civic organizations. It's revitalization that seeks to ensure that the benefits of the improved prosperity are shared with the pre-existing residents and businesses, or at the very least that they're not worse off as a result of the revitalization. It's also a process that's designed to lead to economic integration as a long-term reality in terms of continuing access to economic opportunity rather than just a transitional state during the revitalization itself. Now, revitalization in older cities that involves large-scale public and private investment in the built environment typically is focused either on a single neighborhood or on a limited set of neighborhoods. And such revitalization can take various forms. And what I've listed here are some of the common forms. Revitalization of a residential area that may be a result of demolition of public housing or of large areas of dilapidated housing. Revitalization of a mixed-use area such as a residential and non-residential area. And my fellow panelist, Sophie Dagenais, will be talking about an example in East Baltimore that involved such a mixed-use area. revitalization of a predominantly industrial, commercial, or institutional area, and this might be something such as development of an industrial park or expansion or redevelopment of the footprint of a hospital or university, or revitalization along a transportation corridor. And some of the revitalization that's occurring in Detroit is transit-oriented development that really follows this scenario. Now, for those revitalization scenarios that I've just discussed, there's an array of measures that are commonly used to assess those revitalization efforts. And these are really metrics for measuring changes at the neighborhood level. And I'm not sure how clear this list is to the folks in the back of the room, but I'll just run through them quickly. It's improvements in the physical infrastructure, and decrease in blight, increase in investment and in population, improved housing quality and increased property values, increased home ownership rates, reduced crime rates, increase in jobs and in the employment rate in the area, increase in median household income, and in the tax revenues generated. And all of these metrics are really useful measures for assessing various aspects of the changes in the vitality of the target area. But what's really important is that none of these metrics specifically measures whether the pre-existing low and moderate income residents and the pre-existing local businesses are benefiting from revitalization. To get at whether those populations are benefiting, you need to consider other metrics. In determining what kinds of additional metrics you want to look at, there are some questions that are useful to ask. One question is, are there residents or businesses in the target area that are being displaced, either temporarily or permanently? And if the answer is yes, then one of the follow-up questions you might ask is, what efforts are being undertaken to ensure that, at worst, these residents and businesses are held harmless, in the sense that they're no worse off than they were prior to the revitalization occurring, and ideally are better off? Another question you might ask is for the low and moderate income residents from the area and the pre-existing businesses that are staying throughout the whole revitalization process, what actions are being undertaken to minimize the negative impact during the revitalization process, as well as the long-term benefits that they may realize? Another question is, are there low and moderate income residents in businesses in the contiguous neighborhoods, or even citywide and regionally, that also might be impacted by the revitalization process? So it's important to look beyond just the boundaries of the target neighborhood, to look at these larger geographic areas and try to assess both the positive and the negative impacts. Now, the particular additional metrics that you might want to track will vary depending on the particular circumstances of the revitalization effort. But what I'm trying to do here is just identify some possibilities that you might want to consider. For instance, for the pre-existing low and moderate income residents in the target area, the number and the percentage are moving to better yet affordable housing after revitalization. And to the extent to which some of them have been temporarily relocated, the number and the percentage that are moving back into the new or rehabilitated housing in the target area. The number and percentage who are homeowners. The number and percentage of those individuals that improve their educational levels and marketable vocational skills. The number and percentage who are employed or gain employment. In those that either achieve increases in wages or achieve improvements in their employment-related benefits. Also looking at, for this population, whether there's reductions in health disparities for the pre-existing residents of the target area compared to the citywide and metropolitan area population. And some of the aspects of health disparities you would look at is the presence of a medical home, access to affordable health care, asthma rates, diabetes rates, incidence of lead paint poisoning, and such factors. For the pre-existing businesses, you might look at the number and percentage that remain in the location and maintain or increase their sales volume and profit margins both throughout the revitalization and after the revitalization is over. Or you could look at the number and percentage of the pre-existing businesses that successfully relocate and also maintain or increase their sales volume and profit margins in their new location. You'd also want to look at the number that are sold for a fair market price and the number and percentage that fail or otherwise close. Now, when you're dealing with the pre-existing businesses, often in a distressed neighborhood or what might be an underperforming commercial district, there's both a lot of vacant commercial properties, but also low-end businesses, like a predominance of T-shirt shops, nail salons. And those businesses have, in fact, provided services to the community. They've provided jobs, but they've also might have tended to retard the vitality and the diversity of the services and amenities available to the community. So there's a dilemma as part of the revitalization that, in fact, to generate more vitality in the commercial district, to generate more services, make sure there's more services available to residents in the target area, you may want some of those businesses to leave and be replaced. But from a standpoint of considering what's equitable, you also want to make sure that those businesses are as much as possible held harmless. They're not worse off as a result of the revitalization. Then in terms of at the targeted geographic area, you want to look at things like improvements in public transportation, and particularly public transportation that might bring residents to employment centers or to facilities such as healthcare centers. You also want to look at public transportation improvements that bring additional individuals into the community to take advantage of, to help sort of have a multiplier effect in terms of improving the local economy. You want to look at increases in other services and amenities in the area that meet the needs of the low and moderate income residents and not just the needs of the more affluent residents. And so things like access to a healthcare center or having a fresh food grocery store at affordable rates, or the location of a library or other recreational or educational facilities in the community. And then you also want to look at the improvements in the quality of the local schools, and particularly the public and charter schools. So these are just a few of the sorts of metrics that you'd want to look at. And as my presentation, I think, suggests, that if one is really concerned about promoting equitable revitalization, it requires one to address more issues and undertake more activities than standard revitalization that just looks at the physical environment or at more aggregate economic indicators. It's also more demanding relative to the ongoing tracking and assessment that would be entailed in terms of really assessing what the impact is. If you want to assess the impact on the pre-existing residents and businesses, it requires tracking those specific individuals and those specific businesses. It's not enough to look at sort of the overall neighborhood-wide statistics. You need to know what happened to those families, what happened to those businesses, which tends to be a challenging and costly undertaking, but you need to do it if you're concerned about measuring equity. And so, what this indicates is, if you are concerned about equitable revitalization, you need to approach the effort with a clear appreciation of the additional resources and efforts that will be necessary.
Thank you, Scott. There are a number of seats in the first 2 or 3 rows down here. If anyone standing at the back would like to come in, particularly during this transitional moment, please feel welcome. We won't necessarily call on you first. Not necessarily. Thank you, Scott. It probably shouldn't go without saying that if we were having this conference 10 or 15 years ago, there are a lot of things that you've said that we wouldn't be taking for granted that might not have even been in the conversation. The history of urban renewal in these cities and in the country as a whole started with virtually no attention to these questions of who benefits or tracking residents or even acknowledging that they had a long-term set of interests. And it's a series of struggles and growing awareness over the last 40 years that has brought us to the point we're at today, which, while the problem is not solved, is a lot more explicit. So when we go through our discussion, we'll come back to the versions of the question of who's responsible for being aware of this, for tracking the sorts of things that you've just described, for commissioning the kinds of data and analysis and research that would be necessary to pay attention to equity. And even preliminary answers reminds us that this isn't simply about city government. It isn't even simply about government writ large and federal urban policy. It's partly about philanthropy. And we'll hear from Sophie in a minute about how a national foundation works in its hometown. But it's also about the business community, both the developers and the large corporations and small businesses in a city. It's about the community developers, the nonprofit housing developers and commercial developers who are helping to remake this. It's about residents organized. All of these folks have a stake and an interest in thinking through how we define equity in revitalization and how we measure it. Sophie, do you want to tell us a little about how the Casey Foundation thinks about this, how you go about the work in Baltimore, and maybe a little bit about the way in which some of these things are being measured and tracked in the East Baltimore Revitalization Initiative? And in interest of full disclosure, I've been with my colleagues at Policy Link working with Sophie and her colleagues for the last year and a half on tracking some of the economic inclusion policies in the East Baltimore Initiative. So?
Thank you, Victor. Interesting enough, Victor, I too was going to make an observation after Scott's remarks. You know, data takes many forms and serves many purposes, and the truth is that we have data today that if we had had 15 years ago, we might well have done certain things differently. So it'll be interesting to uncover those. But before I begin, a couple of housekeeping items. First, I want to acknowledge in the audience a couple of colleagues in the work. I did see Salem Reiner from the Johns Hopkins University, an important partner and anchor in our work in East Baltimore. And I think I saw Lori Latuda from the Goldsecker Foundation, another important foundation in Baltimore, an early architect of the work in East Baltimore. And so if there are others in the audience from Baltimore, don't hesitate to raise your hand. But I happened to see Lori and Salem and wanted to acknowledge them. Before I begin, I don't want to make too many assumptions, and I'd like to offer a little bit of background on the inspiration for our work at Casey. Not all of you know that back in 1948, Jim Casey and his siblings established a foundation in honor of their mom, who had raised them as a single mother after their father died. And she kept the family together and provided for them and inspired them over the years to establish the foundation. At a very young age, Jim Casey, he was 11 when he left school. And 8 years later, he established a bicycle messenger service, which is now known as UPS. And he and his siblings, to honor their mom and also in appreciation for their own family's challenges, but also in recognition of what Jim Casey had come to observe at UPS, which is to say that the employees that were having the most difficulty showing up or staying at work and performing well were those he had come to learn were struggling at home. And thus, he established the foundation with that. And today, our mission continues to be to help improve the lives and the futures of disadvantaged children and families in the United States. And we do that by helping to find solutions to overcome barriers to success, helping communities demonstrate what works, and influencing decision makers to make data-driven investments for strategies that are successful. We believe that children do well when their families do well, and families do better when they are in supportive communities, which is a very nice segue to the work that we do in East Baltimore. The foundation has been in Baltimore, headquartered in Baltimore since 1994. And in the early 2000s, our then mayor and now governor, Martin O'Malley, joined with city, state officials, and the Johns Hopkins institutions to launch a revitalization initiative named the East Baltimore Revitalization Initiative. And while the Casey Foundation was not a partner at the table in the early stages of the initiative, we eventually did join, and we did so not only because we felt it was the right thing to do in our hometown, but also because we wanted to help ensure and demonstrate, too, that low-income families could benefit as well from an economic development or economic revitalization initiative. We wanted to be sure that the few residents who remained in the project area, and I'll say a word about that, would also benefit economically and otherwise from the revitalization effort. Indeed, back then, in the 88-acre area, in the shadow of the Hopkins institutions, 70% of the properties had become vacant or abandoned, and the crime rates and the poverty rates were at an all-time high. 742 families would need to be relocated in order to make way for the initiative, which contemplated a very ambitious plan for, as Victor knows, the creation of more than 10,000 jobs associated with what would become a biotech park. There would be over 2,000 new housing units. There would be some retail amenities. And while at the outset, the plan did not contemplate a school, an early learning center, a park, a hotel, a grocery store, over time, with the input of residents, including those residents who would be relocated, the design was amended to include an early learning center and a K-8 school, which just opened, by the way, known as Henderson Hopkins. In short, you may have read about it in the front page of the New York Times, but also contemplates a number of other amenities that have been designed in concert with the community and that are intended to be for the community and by the community. So a central value in the initiative was, has been, and continues to be economic inclusion. I'll end here, Victor, for now, except to say that one of the things that we know, in terms of measuring impact, one of the things that we know and that we've learned is the importance of transparent and effective processes for data collection and data sharing, for continuous improvement, for performance management, for transparency. Hi, Scott. For decision-making purposes and for accountability. And so I look forward to talking about those many aspects of measuring impact.
Thank you. And that is indeed one of the 3 or 4 broad areas, that last point that Sophie made, that we're going to come back to and ask her to elaborate on, and all of our panelists. It has been a rare opportunity for us to be able to work with all the partners in the initiative to see how that has progressed over the years, and indeed what sort of data sources can be made available when folks put their mind to it. In many cases, from the start 11 years ago and going into the future 5 or 10 more years. So we'll get back to that and talk about it a little more. We'll ask, before we engage that broader discussion, we'll ask Manuel Pastor to come up and describe a little about the regional equity profiles, and perhaps, and appreciate, Manuel, on such short notice, your sense of how that endeavor might fit into the questions we're asking here today.
Great, thanks, Victor. So I was first asked to do this in an email that I received while I was on a red-eye flight into Philadelphia. I was then reminded of this request right after the plenary session. I was told I would make a presentation. I was then shifted to commentary, back to a presentation. What I'm going to do instead is talk a little bit about this tool which tries to step back from the level of the neighborhood. I know, I'm still laughing too. And that he even thought that would happen. And talk a little bit about these regional equity profiles we've been doing, which have been an attempt to try to get a conversation going on about why equitable revitalization is so crucial. We've done these now for extensively for 4, a little bit more for I think another 8, and we'll be continuing to do them. And what they are is an attempt to look at particular regions and actually to try to frame the argument about why equitable revitalization matters. It matters because of the changing demography of the country. It matters because we know that income inequality has become an Achilles heel for economic growth. And what we need to do to move forward is an equity-driven kind of model. And the one thing I would say about this is that the framing is as important as the data. If you're putting numbers out there but you haven't got a story about why you're going to be bringing people to the table about them, it's not clear that they will make a change. So we try to define an equitable region as one in which all residents, regardless of their ethnicity or nativity or neighborhood, are able to fully function in the region's economic vitality. And we wind up defining these equity indicators around demographics, economic vitality, readiness, and connectedness. And I want to just give you kind of a sampling of what some of those are. The PowerPoints that we've done for each one of these regions are about 105 to 150 slides long. I would have to talk even faster than I'm talking right now to get through them. In fact, I'd probably have to talk in Spanish because I speak that much more quickly. However, some of you are Spanish impaired and wouldn't understand. So on the demography, we think it's very important to lead first by letting people know how their regions are changing. Particularly, for example, in Kansas City, the share of population growth attributable to communities of color since the year 2000, 2/3 of their population growth is coming from communities of color, African Americans and Latinos. It's still a predominantly white region, but you could see that one of the things that we do with these profiles is break the groups up, not simply by their race and ethnicity, but also by their nativity, because the experience of native-born Latinos, for example, is very different than the experience of immigrant Latinos, and that's something that's really important to keep in mind. But we try to use maps. These are maps that show that the people of color are driving growth throughout the region. There's, by the way, the kind of moving into yellow shades means big increases in people of color. You're going to notice that where there's actually decline, and this is typical of a lot of America's cities, is actually in the central city. That is, the core cities of the United States tend to be whitening, and it's the suburbs that are actually diversifying, something that's incredibly important because it's in the suburbs that we don't have good social services infrastructure, don't have good civic infrastructure, and don't have community organizing infrastructure so that low-income people can raise their voices. One thing we think is important is to point out that regions are going to continue to diversify. Another one that we did was for Salt Lake. I know when you think of Salt Lake, I don't know what you think, but I think Salt Lake's probably pretty white, right? In fact, because they're Mormon, maybe super white, right? And that's like super bright paint. That's true. For example, in 1980, Salt Lake Metro was 95% non-Hispanic white. However, the Salt Lake Metro will become majority people of color in about 2033, 10 years before the country, going through rapid demographic change, and that's a conversation changer that we think is important. I'm going to jump over this. We tend to look at economic vitality, so we look at the unemployment rate for the region over time, but then we also look at the difference between the unemployment rate for people of color and non-Hispanic whites. And this just shows you where you've got heavier people of color tracks, you also have much higher general unemployment rates. Declining or stagnant wages, we think it's important to take a look at the wage distribution. One of the things that's interesting about Kansas City is actually it's not becoming unequal as fast as the rest of the country, which is actually a kind of interesting phenomena. It's one we're trying to explore in some other projects. However, it's important to look at poverty and working poverty. And one important thing I think that's really it was something that got mentioned yesterday in the plenary, is that there's a tendency to think that we will solve everything with education, right? That if we just educate, things will change. And the problem with that is that there are clear, persistent differences by race and ethnicity, even at every level of education. So there's still discrimination out there in the labor markets, and there's also spatial and social network effects that are not going to be overcome purely by education. So while the work in education is important, it's important to think about the other issues as well. One of the things that we do, and I'm not going to go through the detail, but suggest to you that it's an important thing to do, is to try to define high opportunity occupations by looking at what their median wage is, and then whether or not there's going to be lots of growth in that industry, and whether there's projected wage growth in those industries. And classifying the sectors of the economy by high opportunity, middle opportunity, and low opportunity. And when you do that and take a look at the racial breakdown, and here blue as high opportunity, and starting on the left-hand side, non-Hispanic whites, you can see that if you move across this, that essentially you're in a situation in which the way the future of the economy looks, it's a recipe for growing inequality because African Americans and Latinos, immigrants, and non-U.S. born are crowded into the low opportunity professions rather than into the high opportunity, that is high wage, likely to grow in the future kind of professions. And we find that leading with a conversation about the future can often help to drive change. So I'm going to close with a really emotional conclusion because I bet I'm out of time. So we do a lot of stuff on readiness, how ready the population is in terms of education, disconnected youth, et cetera. But fundamentally, solving a lot of these problems has to do with making social connections between neighborhoods, between sectors of the economy, between geographies in a region. So one of the things we try to take a look at is how polarized or sorted communities are. For example, the percent of people of color living in high poverty tracts in Kansas City is about 8% versus only about 1% for non-Hispanic whites. Lots of problems with housing as well. So looking at concentrated poverty, et cetera. Looking at the relationship in terms of people using the transit system. And, by the way, this is communities of color who are more likely to be carless, that is without auto, not careless. The implications. One of the things I want to say, and I think it's important about the data that Scott is pointing to, what Sophie's talking about is happening in Baltimore, is that the data are an opportunity to create a conversation about what the future is going to look like. And so one of the things I think is to make sure that whatever data gets collected, it's certainly a way of dealing with accountability, but it's also a way of lifting up the opportunities to make the investments in communities that will help revitalize them without moving them out, that will help make sure that the benefits of revitalizing a region as something that spreads to all communities, and to make sure that the opportunities actually do trickle out, not down, and bubble up from the communities that we're concerned about. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. And thanks for your willingness and your skill at I don't know if condensing is quite the right word, because I think you got across a tremendous amount. And for those of you who would like to look at these in more depth or at your leisure, as they are finished, the first 4 profiles are being put online. The one for the state of Rhode Island, that is not just Providence, but in that case, the entire state, is on the PolicyLink website at this point. PolicyLink.org, and is it on the Peer? Do we have them separately listed? I can't remember. On the Peer website as well, the Program on Environmental and Regional Equity, the University of Southern California. The one for Kansas City is out as well. I believe it's on our site, and the kickoff for that was a couple of months ago, and Manuel mentioned it in his plenary yesterday, that it was partly done as a discussion with the folks pulled together by the Chamber of Commerce. So it's not only a sort of usual equity suspects dialogue conversation that the data can promote. The one for Houston, and I think the Houston metro area is bigger than the state of Rhode Island in almost every respect, 12 counties, I believe, maybe 14. It will be released in a community meeting next month. And the 4th of the original ones is for Southeast Florida. Not yet scheduled, but almost complete. So keep track of Peer and PolicyLink, and you'll be able to see those. We also have one in the works for Detroit. And every month, Kurt Metzger writes me an email and asks me when it's going to be done. And I tell him in 1 more month. And since he's not here today, I don't have to tell him again. But I'll tell you that within a month or 2, we will also have one for the metropolitan area of Detroit, which we hope will contribute to a dialogue about regional equity. If there's any region in the country that can benefit from the kind of dialogue that Manuel just described, it certainly is Detroit, both because of the challenges and the history, but also some really important opportunities. And then, since we wore ourselves out doing one with 105 slides, we've scaled back and we're doing sort of mini profiles, and there will be 5 of those. They'll all be different regions that are participating in HUD's Sustainable Communities Initiative, and they'll be done over the summer. I don't recall what the 5 regions are all at hand, but they will give us a geographic spread. There'll be smaller regions than the ones I just mentioned, and a lot of them will be in the South and the Southwest, and we'll begin to get a good cross-section of the country. Ultimately, there will be a website, so we won't have to do any more of this. You can do it all yourselves. But under pain of death, I'm not allowed to say when that website will be ready because it's a very complicated thing to put together. But we're getting there. We're working towards it. So, Manuel, again, I can't thank you enough for stepping in and think about ways to talk about the regional conversation as we go forward. So as promised, we'll start this discussion and dialogue among the panelists for a while on some of the big issues that they teed up. Sophie, it's clear that one of the big objectives of the East Baltimore Revitalization Initiative, as you mentioned, is job creation. As many as 10,000 jobs originally projected, and it will at least be 5,000 or 6,000, plus at least 4,000 or 5,000 construction jobs. So if we take those in turn, say construction work, and then work in the biotech industry and in the medical centers, and then the third category I'd call local business, all of the people who are going to work in the hotels and the restaurants and in the mixed-income, mixed-use community that's created. What are the important things that you've seen and learned about what we have to track, about who gets trained and who gets the jobs, and how progress is made on that, and what kind of conversations, as to use Manuel's terms, either have happened or need to happen with regard to making sure that the jobs that are created are a benefit to local residents and a good fit with the local economy?
Thank you, Victor. I think we've learned many important lessons. First, I would like to differentiate between some of the data collection work that we have participated in, supported, expected, along with our partners, to help ensure that we would have the information toward the question of, are we accomplishing our purposes? Are we making progress? Are the jobs being created? Are people connecting to the jobs? But also, and this is important in the work on the ground, the process of collecting data was also important for the purposes of building trust in the community and being very, very transparent and making data available in the community, because the initiative, while very promising and ambitious, was anxiety-producing. Families had to be relocated. Folks wondered what would happen to their communities where they had lived or their families had lived for decades upon decades. And so we've learned lessons along all of these lines. But I would say that what we've learned is, not surprisingly, that not all jobs are the same, and not all residents or individuals are prepared in the same way for all jobs. And so I think that we jumped very, very quickly, although maybe not quickly enough. Some could argue that, in retrospect, if only we could have begun years before the initiative was launched to work with residents toward connectivity to jobs. But for the moment, let's just speak about what was done. And EBDI, East Baltimore Development, Inc., was an organization that was formed for the purposes of implementing the Revitalization Initiative. And EBDI was an important partner, Victor, as you know, in helping to ensure that as jobs were created, residents would have an opportunity to gain them. And what we've come to find out is that not everyone is prepared in the same way for that construction job that you mentioned. Not everyone is prepared in the same way for that job at the 7-Eleven that just opened or the hotel that will open. And certainly not everyone is prepared for the biotech jobs that would be created. Now, admittedly, as you all know, the last decades have marked a very significant economic recession, and so some of the progress that we were hoping to make in East Baltimore we have not yet made, but yet there has been tremendous progress. The biotech jobs that we were expecting have not yet materialized in as significant a way as we had hoped. However, as you point out, Victor, a number of other jobs have, the construction jobs have, and the retail jobs have, the support jobs have. Another important lesson, there's the preparedness and the level of skills lesson, not one size fits all. How do we prepare for that? Another another important lesson relates to who is best suited to play the role of connecting residents to jobs. And while East Baltimore Development, Inc. Was a brand new organization with support from partners across various levels of industry in Baltimore, city and state government were represented, stakeholders were at the table, Casey Foundation at the table, Hopkins at the table. That did not necessarily make that organization the best organization or the best vehicle for fulfilling this inclusion mandate. Nevertheless, it was very effective in creating a pipeline and making sure that as residents were relocated, they could access the pipeline and potentially access jobs as they were created. Very important in terms of measuring impact and data collection. What is the population we are trying to follow? Certainly from the Casey perspective, when we invested in the initiative at first, we cared about the impact of the initiative on place, and we did also care about the impact of the initiative on people. Our first priority were to be the relocated residents. Mm-hmm. Now, the jobs that were being created might be suitable for the relocated residents, or they might not. And so we had to sort of open up our minds and work with our partners to help ensure that perhaps what we ought to be thinking about population-wise is a greater population. Was it the population of East Baltimore? Was it the entire population of Baltimore City? What would success look like? Would we be happy if a diverse population from the region tapped into the jobs created by the initiative? Would we only be happy if all of the relocated residents somehow tapped into those jobs? And so we've had to adjust our language and our dialogue and I think our expectations along these lines. And to this day, the issue is actually not resolved among all the partners. There are partners who care more about certain populations, who are far more intent on making sure that the residents of the immediate area are those that first have priority to these opportunities, whereas others would argue, listen, there's a great need in our entire city. And perhaps not all of the opportunities are suitable for relocated residents, but aren't there other opportunities elsewhere in the city that would be suitable for relocated residents? And so you have to adjust your thinking, and we've had to adjust our thinking and therefore our investments. I would say those are two of the more important lessons. Making sure you've identified the population, mm-hmm. and making sure that you recognize the diverse needs and the diversity of the opportunities to us so as to best match them with the population.
Thank you. Manuel, how does, in your experience, whether it's the reactions you got in Kansas City or any of the places you've worked in Los Angeles or anywhere else, how does the conversation about equity in employment and access to jobs become a regional discussion most productively? Or maybe more basically, how does it happen in the first place? And then how can it be as productive as possible? Oftentimes the equity advocates are focused on what happens in their immediate neighborhood and at the jobs that are geographically closest at hand. But even in this case, the biotech industry is big in the city of Baltimore, both East and West Baltimore, but it's also huge in the entire region. It's one of the biggest regions for biotech in the country. And access to jobs is ultimately a regional equity issue. But what are some of the pointers you could give us about how that comes to pass or how it could?
Well, I'm glad you didn't ask me to ask a question that Kurt could have answered. So, the West Coast experience, I think, is a little bit different. And part of it, as I've talked about before, is that after the Los Angeles civil unrest, people really began to rethink their approaches to both community development and community organizing, and regions became an important part of thinking about that. So typical of that was a campaign launched out of South LA when DreamWorks, fairly well-known studio, was about to get a subsidy from the city of LA to locate in Los Angeles, which the idea of giving $75 million to Steve Spielberg didn't seem like maybe the right thing to do. But what a group out of South LA Scope lobbied for was the creation of a job training program based in the community colleges in South LA so people could become part of the animation studios that DreamWorks was going to build. What's interesting about that, some of you know the end of the story, DreamWorks decided not to build a new studio. However, they wound up sticking with that deal and creating a work program called Workplace Hollywood to actually train people from South LA, East LA, et cetera, to work in this regional industry. I mean, we've done some of the same thing with the community benefits agreements. The community benefits agreements are at LA Live, around the LA airport, and some of the work around the ports has always had a bit of a lever to benefit local residents, but it's also tried to benefit residents more generally who can tap into those parts of the labor market. And I think kind of balancing that, those two strategies has been part of an important mix. And that's happened too with a program now that we've got for retrofitting municipal buildings to make them greener, which has got a construction careers program that taps into, in particular, African American and Latino kids in South and East LA. And so there's a bit of a geographic emphasis to it, as well as a sort of just needs-based kind of approach. One other kind of quick answer to this is I think that you have to combine a big and inclusive vision about why this is good for the regional economy with a gigantic stick of community organizing to force people to do the right thing. It's amazing how people will do the right thing that's good for them if you force them to. Many of you may have noticed this with your children. But, you know, sometimes, I mean, it turns out now developers in Los Angeles go, man, we want a community benefits agreement because it's going to make sure we get through the city council quickly. We're going to get employees. We're going to be working with folks who can supply us with folks. The construction industry, which is initially resistant to making sure you tapped into African American, Latino youngsters, are going, wait a minute, we don't have young whites coming up who want to be part of the construction industry. If we're going to keep the union strong, we're going to need to make sure that we do this. So you sometimes have to combine a big and inclusive and warm, fuzzy kind of vision with some pretty hard-edged organizing that's really about power and leverage.
Great. Thank you. Scott, in the way you laid out the important things to measure, you placed a high priority on tracking what happens to the current residents. Are there some examples that you can cite or some things you'd propose from your experience about with respect to employment and respect to jobs and income, where either the current residents of an anticipated project or the relocated residents of an ongoing project, that we know enough about how they've done and that we've tracked the help that's been provided to them so that you could say we're measuring an attempt to achieve equity?
I think the short answer is what I presented is very aspirational. Mm-hmm. And there is not a lot of examples. In fact, at the beginning of the East Baltimore Development Initiative, there was a significant effort to try to assign caseworkers and track what was happening to all the individuals that were being temporarily relocated in order to ensure that, you know, they were better off as much as possible. And there was case management, there was relocation assistance, but that's a very expensive proposition. And you know, I think one of the key issues that these things need champions. You know, even though it may in fact be in a community's interest, in a city's interest, or a region's interest to do these things, they don't necessarily understand that because they haven't had Manuel yet do the profile for them and do the pep talk. They also, even when they understand it, sort of, it seems overwhelming. You know, for instance, in Baltimore, I've been working in evaluating an effort that looks at both East Baltimore and Central Baltimore and West Baltimore. It's the Baltimore Integration Initiative that has a similar goal of economic inclusion. And one of the things they've looked at is to try to make the connection between capital investment and connecting that to job opportunities for residents. The disconnect in terms of the skill levels of residents. In Baltimore, 9,000 of the adults of working age don't have a high school diploma or GED, and a large number of those that do have a high school diploma tests at less than an 8th grade reading and math level. And that's sort of a bottom line threshold that you need to be able to to have those skill levels in order to get the construction jobs where you have to do a certain level of math. But the idea of that's a huge problem to tackle, it just seems overwhelming. So I think in addition to sort of promoting the big vision and promoting the will through community organizing, you also need to sort of break it down into manageable pieces and say, we recognize you can't do everything at once, but let's agree on the steps we can take to get the ball rolling. And I think that's important. But for that to happen, you really need a champion. Mm-hmm. You need a champion both in terms of, and the champion doesn't necessarily have to just come from philanthropy. Although Casey was a huge champion in the East Baltimore Development Initiative, it can come from the city, it can come from the private sector, but you need champions that are going to not only say this is something that we need to do for the future of our community or the future of our region, but also we recognize it's going to take more effort and more coordinated effort among various resources than we've previously been able to put together. We need to make that happen. And we need to make the investment in tracking it, make the data investment.
Thank you. Before we leave the topic of employment, for the moment at least, Manuel, if I can, since you had to race through this, can I ask you to come back a little bit to the notion of high opportunity jobs and sectors and what that might mean for the kinds of discussion we're having here? Explain a little about what the profiles say about it, or how that fits into the national interest in trying to identify and respond to those sectors.
Sophie, did you want to say something? You had a two-hander, it looked like.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I missed that. I'm supposed to be good at those two-hander things.
Thank you. I wanted to help maybe close the loop that Scott helped to open up. In terms of, by the way, I think what we are coming to learn quickly, what we've come to learn is in terms of the championing concept, I think Manuel has exactly the right recipe, which is to say you recruit champions and you create champions by talking about the future and the opportunity. But I just wanted to talk about, for just a moment, the issue of relocated residents and the family advocacy support services that were provided for them. So quickly, 742 households needed to be relocated in order to make way for the initiative. And there are federal laws that apply when one attempts to displace residents. And there's a there's a law called the Uniform Relocation Act, which would have provided for very basic benefits to families that needed to be relocated. Instead, the Anna E. Casey Foundation, in partnership with Johns Hopkins, came together and worked with residents to negotiate a far more generous and dignified package for residents that included greater economic compensation, as well as the promise of family advocacy services, counseling services to be made available to the families for 5 years post-relocation. And so to your point, Scott, these services ranged from housing counseling which included helping families determine where they were going to purchase their new home or rent their new home with the benefits. Important data lesson. We as partners did not insist on the longitudinal tracking that Scott referenced earlier, which is complicated for many reasons. It's very costly, but it also requires the will of the people. And, these family advocacy services were voluntary by nature. Residents would either avail themselves of them or not. And not everyone did. Many did. Some did for a period of time, and some are no longer. And many no longer care to be in touch with the agencies and the partners in the initiative, and I think we have to pay very, very close attention to that as well. Data collection carries some anxiety-producing components as well, and we decided that we would allow residents to make decisions for themselves. And so what we do know, because I suspect people will want to know what we do know from research in partnership with residents is that the great majority of them did relocate to much stronger neighborhoods. When you look at economic indicators and other indicators indicative of public safety and otherwise, the majority of residents moved to much stronger neighborhoods. Many residents relocated in place thanks to programs that were devised in partnership with EBDI. Residents were able to use their relocation benefit to either reinvestment in their homes that didn't have to be demolished, they rehabilitated their homes, or they traded their house for a house. Lastly, the first 2 housing projects that were built in the initiative before the market collapsed were housing projects that made units available to a mixed income of residents, including low-income residents who once lived there, as well as seniors, so that they would not have to be displaced for longer than they needed to be. So I did want to make those points to close the loop, Scott.
Absolutely. Manuel, do you want to try to say a little more about opportunity-rich or high-opportunity sectors and what that might mean for regional equity?
Yeah, when we go around talking to both regions, but then also to local neighborhoods and show them some profiles of the regions they're a part of, the graph that seems to attract the most interest is what's called a bubble chart. And a bubble chart, which only nerds like me genuinely love, is got basically, it arrays circles by the size of the circle is the size of the industry. The horizontal is the rapidity of growth of the sector, and the vertical is the wage rates in the sector. And so it basically shows you how big a sector is, has it been growing over time, and what are the wages that it pays. And if you're in a community organization, immediately people go, I want me one of those jobs, right? And how do I get there? And so one of the things I think that's really useful about this is getting community-based organizations more in touch with where the jobs are heading in the future, where the training needs to be, maybe where some of the strategies like making sure the math skills are okay, working on ban the box so that ex-felons can actually get into the labor market, et cetera. Those kind of things can be tied to getting to good opportunity. The other thing I think that's really useful about this is that when community-based organizations are talking about where the economy is headed, they're more likely to find business support and business allies, because sometimes what business thinks is people are just complaining about their situation rather than actively trying to change things in a way that will tap them into the dynamism of the economy. So again, it's kind of part of changing the conversation, as well as actually strategizing what industries make the most sense and which ones are, another really important thing, are sticky, are not likely to go anywhere. And I think to some extent we wind up spending a lot of time on sort of the services and health industries, partly because of it, and those are good jobs. But in a regional economy, it only does as well as its drivers, the industries that actually export to other sectors, and figuring out how to tap into those, how to support those, and how to make the equity and growth agenda come together. Sounds pretty much like a conference called Bridging Growth and Opportunity.
And if you're Johns Hopkins or you're the Cleveland Clinic and you have patients coming from all over the world, then medicine is an export sector. For most places, it isn't. Most places, the medical care takes care of the people who live there. So that it makes it an interesting angle for some of these cities, an angle that doesn't always apply. Same with biotech. If you reach a threshold that it's one of the largest clusters in the country, if not the world, it has a different format than virtually every region in the country that says they're going to have a biotech sector. And the kind of thoughtfulness that we're starting to see in these analyses, when they have that equity focus and when they have the community partners at the table, can be very powerful stuff. Well, let's ask the question that Kurt would have asked, actually, Manuel, but any of you can choose to take it on or not. Kurt Metzger from Data Driven Detroit was talking in preparation for this panel about the question of how do we measure progress and health of neighborhoods around a city like Detroit when there is new investment in one neighborhood, in this case Midtown Detroit, where the big anchors are, the universities and hospitals, where the new rail line is going in, where a lot of new entrepreneurs are setting up shop, and where there is, in effect, a housing boom and a housing shortage despite the conditions in the rest of Detroit. How do we measure improvements in the incomes and conditions, and what should we be looking for to see if a big investment in a downtown or a midtown or an East Baltimore focused large-scale development, every city has one, how do those benefits redound to the workforce and the residents of the rest of the city and the rest of the region? Or how will we know? Anyone want to take a start at that?
Yeah, I think one of the things you would look at is, what are in the areas where you're reinvesting, what you perceive as the economic engine? Mm-hmm. And then is there a sort of a larger industry cluster around that economic engine where there's a lot of vendors that serve that economic engine, and then you want to look at where are those vendors located. Are they located in proximity or in the contiguous communities or in the region, or are they across the country? And if they are within the region, or you can encourage a focus on using vendors or developing vendors in the region, like who works for them. Mm-hmm. So it's taking a more sophisticated look at sort of where the economic benefits are flowing. And it's the trickle out and bubble up that Manuel was talking about.
Anyone else want to take that on in particular? Or I think in Detroit it's clear that there's a lot more preparation and capacity building for small firms that needs to be done and that people are organizing to do in order to have them capture more of the business of the anchor institutions. It's kind of ironic because in some ways the anchors are encouraging workers to live in the neighborhood nearby, providing housing incentives. That doesn't do much for stabilizing the housing of the other neighborhoods in Detroit, where folks with stable incomes are often hard-pressed to stay if there's considerable abandonment around them. That's part of that challenge. But, yeah.
Well, the thing I was getting at to this is that we have the fact that the American Community Survey now gives us a 5-year rolling average of what's happening in neighborhoods. I think it's going to be kind of important for tracking neighborhoods over time instead of getting the decade-by-decade snapshot. I mean, the challenge with that is that it's usually 2.5 to 3 years out of date. But, that beats being 8 or 9 years out of date, which is what we used to be, at least half a decade. I think one of the things that we might want to do for the data nerds amongst us is begin to look for patterns in that data so that you can see how a neighborhood is changing over time, and then whether or not a neighborhood that looks like it's on the beginning of another neighborhood's growth path so if you can watch the processes of gentrification that's occurring in Midtown Los Angeles, and then begin to ask the question, what does that look like in other parts of the country, and can we use past to predict future and think about some of the risks ahead? I think there's going to be a lot that we can do with the way in which the ACS is collected every year, or we'll have a rolling 5-year average every year.
Thank you. So several of you in your opening remarks referred to various aspects of the importance of transparency, the capacity for data and good analysis to be the opportunity to create a conversation, be it about a neighborhood, about a city or a region, and alluded to the importance of different kinds of intermediaries to bring about that conversation. But I'd like to ask each of you to expand on what you think is important and what you might recommend, or what from your recent experience you would say is critical about having this kind of data and mapping and research play an important role in focusing this kind of revitalization on equity issues. Sophie?
I'll start by maybe raising a couple of different concepts. In the case of the East Baltimore Revitalization Initiative, the data infrastructure grew over time. And in fact, again, in the spirit of inclusion, as well as in this, part of inclusion is community engagement is but one manifestation of inclusion. But the data infrastructure grew over time, and I'll highlight a couple of different ways. First, the EBDI came to establish what is currently still known as the Economic Inclusion Committee, which meets very, very regularly in the community. It's a wide open meeting, and attendees range from relocated residents who return and want to hear about the data that's been collected insofar as job creation and job opportunities have been concerned, as well as economic opportunities in the form of contracts and so forth. So relocated residents, current residents, residents from the perimeter areas, frankly residents from elsewhere in the city who are interested in the impact of the initiative, as well as potential employers, stakeholders and like that show up, and there is a very long community meeting that takes place and that shares the data with everyone raises important questions. As you can imagine, there are oftentimes very heated debates in the room concerning inclusion and the results of the effort. So that goes to transparency a little bit and the importance of engaging community. And it's one means of making sure that the data is accessible, because all of us can invest in very, very sophisticated forms of data infrastructures, it may well be that that data collection will be available to us as researchers, to us as funders, and to us as any other role. But is the data available to the community? And so how can we further and promote complete transparency for the benefit of all who are engaged in the effort? So that was one way for EBDI to do it, to create this space on a very regular basis for data to be exchanged. Second, very early on, EBDI engaged a data verification firm. And so a third-party firm that to this day comes in and gathers the data that's been collected by other data collectors and literally verifies the data and then puts it back out to the community for sharing as having been independently verified. So I also think that's an important component of at least the data work in East Baltimore. And finally, what I'll add, and then we'll turn it over to the others, and we can keep talking, and I can certainly bring up some other important lessons. In the last, I'll say, and Scott could correct me if I'm wrong, in the last, I would say, 5 years, there is a vehicle that has matured to a very, very heightened level of sophistication, the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, that is attached to the University of Baltimore, and that now puts out what is known as vital signs for neighborhoods across the city. And this is a tool that is now making available on portals that are becoming more and more accessible, data on each of the communities and neighborhoods in Baltimore City along a series of metrics. And the question is and remains, and we continue to explore with them, how do we make sure that those who access that data, that information, are not just us researchers or pundits or academics or foundations or and the like, but how do we get that data in the community so that the community can pick that up for itself and inform its own advocacy decisions, its own priorities, the community's own way of protecting itself and informing its own decisions as civic players in the city. So that's something that we're watching very, very closely and wanting to support. But we continue to observe a certain disconnect between the data that's available and the vehicles that are out there and the way in which those are made available on the ground to inform residents.
Yeah,
Thank you. And just before you start, if you have questions, please come up toward the mic. We'll move to those questions immediately after Scott and Manuel have a crack at this last question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I just want to follow up on what Sophie said, that there's the National Neighborhood Indicators Project.
Yes.
And the Baltimore group that she talked about is part of this national network that has, for probably close to 15 years now, been working to improve access to neighborhood-level data. But there is this issue of even though there has been tremendous improvement in the data and sort of the accessibility of that, the challenge of helping community residents become effective consumers of that data.
Yes, exactly.
That you can have all the data in the world, but if folks are still sort of put off by data and don't know how to use it, and so there has to be investments in building that capacity. A lot of the efforts around sort of data capacity building tend to focus on the organizations and the institutions, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done there so that organizations, both individually and collectively, are really data-driven in their sort of decision-making. But at the same time, in order to promote the accountability, you really need to make sure that the residents themselves can be strong advocates for their interests using the data and using the data as a powerful tool.
So I'll just add, and I guess that builds on that, is that first thing you should do is collect what the residents are interested in, not what you're interested in. And I think that turns out to be the central lesson. We just did a project in Southern California because some folks were saying, geez, people ought to be more interested in transit-oriented development and its implications, but they're just not. And we thought, well, that's maybe... And we went and talked to organizers, and one of the organizers with PICO at Interfaith Federation in East LA said, my folks are mostly concerned about work and immigration issues and stuff like that. So instead, we did a report called Agenda for Equity, looking at the relationship between transportation and all of its variants in terms of equity. We did a lot of talking to people, what they were interested in, what they wanted collected, et cetera. And I won't go through all the details, but I will say that PICO organization has just begun a transit-oriented university to train its members on why TOD is so important to their future. But they didn't start there. They got a lot of information. They wound up realizing, oh my God, immigrants are really heavy transit users. Immigrants are mostly the working poor. We better be worried about transit and transit-oriented development. This is going on here. But again, I think starting with asking what are the residents interested in, not what you're interested in. And then you can actually, if you build the trusting relationships, get them to be interested in stuff you think they should be interested in because they trust that you actually delivered on what they were interested in.
Yeah, it's the general lesson of meeting people where they're at. And that's true for residents, employers, philanthropies, whatever.
Absolutely.
Questions from the audience? Please come to the microphone. It's been my experience that the field of public health has a lot to teach the field of community economic development when it comes to developing authentic relationships between researchers and community groups and for policy issues. And the attention and depth of personal relationships as well as what we call capacity building that a lot of CBPR, community-based participatory research practitioners put in is something that folks in a lot of other fields could do well to emulate. And ironically, in the last few years, even though they may start with an environmental justice issue or an environmental health issue, they have ended up with a lot of the same economic development, community economic development issues that we see. That was our experience doing a health impact assessment of the Central Corridor Light Rail Project in St. Paul, Minnesota, with the community group known as Isaiah. It turned out that the health issues the community wanted studied mostly had to do with jobs, mostly had to do with transportation access to jobs around the region, and with the maintenance of affordable housing. And the funders said, well, is that a health impact assessment anymore? And he said, well, that's what the residents said were the important consequences of this potential project. And in the end, all the issues got covered, but it's partly because you build that relationship over time. Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Erin O'Keefe. I'm from Loyola University in Baltimore. And my question really might be for our next session going into the plenary. But you all referenced in one way or the other the importance of community organizing and obviously building that capacity on the ground as it relates to how we move projects forward, how we build communities, how we use metrics and how we get that data directly from communities themselves. And I think what drives me insane is that there's no funding for community organizing. And as we go into the next session, and perhaps even if I'd love to hear your reflections on that, how do we move forward in our work knowing that our community-based organizations are volunteer-run by people who work 1 or 2 jobs and then come home and do this in their free time in neighborhoods that are oftentimes low income, working class, et cetera, et cetera? Thank you.
So the funder gets the first crack at that one.
Well, it's very difficult to argue with the question and the context for the question, in particular in Baltimore, which had such a long, rich history of community organizing and has what I would describe as has suffered a loss over time. And but I do know of lots of interest out there, volunteer or otherwise, to help rebuild that capacity, recognizing the importance of organization. I can't possibly invite grant applications here, but what I will share with you is that a number of us do recognize that dearth of resources We do believe, for example, in East Baltimore, as we look at that long, rich history and examine what we can do to support the reorganizing of community in an area that has now been essentially vacated but is being repopulated. And it's very, very clear to us as we're working at the Casey Foundation, actively working with multiple community organizations that are informal, that are formal, that are inside the project area, that are surrounding the project area, and contemplating how we could possibly be helpful to help rebuild that capacity, because we know that it will be necessary for this community to be the community that we all envisioned. There will need to be a strong feeling of organization and community. So rest assured, I think the resources are scarce, as they are for so many other things in Baltimore and elsewhere. I want to recognize and validate your point that we have suffered a loss in that department, and we're certainly paying attention to it in East Baltimore.
The Casey Foundation, over a 10-year period, had an initiative known as Making Connections that was in 10 cities, and the number of cities decreased to 7 cities over time. But in each of those cities, in all 10 cities, there was a lot of emphasis on the importance of resident voice and building that resident capacity. And Casey, in those communities and across the country, invests a lot in resident leadership development. So to give the residents the tools and the support networks they need. It's certainly not enough resources, but in those Making Connections communities, over the 10-year period, those communities began to understand the value of resident voice, not as, another issue, another group I have to deal with, and therefore it's a problem, but understanding that with that resident voice, the elected officials, the community organizations, both developed a better sense of what the real problems were in the community, what might be the most promising strategies for addressing those, and how to get the community engaged to make sure they were, not, in conflict with what the city fathers were trying to do. And in those communities, it varies somewhat, but in each of those Making Connections communities, resident voice is seen more as a given, that in fact you can't do an initiative unless you engage the local residents. It's the norm now.
So we're blessed in California with a series of funders who really do seem to get this. And essentially it's that, developers tend to be interested in transactions, let's make a deal, and organizers tend to be interested in transformations, let's make a change. And the thing is that they're actually pretty deeply connected. The reason that so many of us could do community development is because the organizing around the Community Reinvestment Act, low-income tax credits, the way in which housing advocates have fought for that sort of stuff. The reason why there's work for workforce developers to do is because of the lobbying of community-based organizations who felt like they got left out of labor markets as they were growing, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think part of it is beginning to educate folks within the foundations to organize them, to understand the important role of community organizing. It seems to have happened in California. People really get that this is a sector that they should be investing in part because one of our biggest place-based initiatives, Building Healthy Communities, funded by the California Endowment, as they've gone in and looked at these communities, the power in those communities is about people organizing themselves to change systems.
I think a very, very good example of that, or manifestation of something like that, Manuel, in Baltimore, lies with an organization whose acronym is BUILD, Baltimoreans United for Leadership Development. This is an organization that's partnered with Casey and others in Baltimore, including Hopkins, and as an example, combining faith-based leadership and community residents to foster transformation in something that's much more than just physical development or physical transformation. And part of what they have helped to accomplish, for example, in partnership with the Reinvestment Fund here in Philadelphia, that has a very strong presence in Baltimore, is the transformation day by day, piece by piece, person by person, of neighborhoods that are surrounding, by the way, the East Baltimore Revitalization Initiative project area, and will soon begin to infiltrate the project area. area, to make sure that residents were organized around these projects, would have a voice in what would take place in their neighborhoods, and as important, particularly on the topic of today, would participate in the transformation, would be connected to jobs. And thanks to the leadership of an organization like BUILD, many residents, many of them previously incarcerated, have had the benefit of good paying jobs and have had the benefit of access to good quality affordable housing.
Did you have a question? Okay.
Hi, Jeff Hornstein from the Philadelphia City Controller's Office. Along the same lines, I couldn't resist to ask the follow-up question, because people are talking about community-based organizations and about equity and jobs. I haven't heard anything about organized labor, and I know in California there's been a lot of partnerships between labor around community benefits agreements, the Staples Center and other places. I'm wondering if that's the case in Baltimore as well. Is organized labor, do they have a seat at the table in any way? Do you see them as partners in this initiative?
So organized labor has been at the table on and off in many different ways, connecting to the initiative, but also connecting to other important practice and policy changes in the citywide. And so they have been involved in, on occasion, you've seen them with community residents on the ground in East Baltimore, dissatisfied with some of the progress. Some bring their own political agendas, of course, as you would imagine, particularly those, not particularly those, but certainly in the case of the construction labor groups, you can imagine what the agendas may be related or unrelated to particular cohorts of city residents. But they've been at the table. They have been at the table in negotiations concerning various legislation at the city and state levels. We've often wondered, we've also talked about it, Scott, you may remember in the context of the Baltimore Integration Partnership, how can we better engage the unions in this effort, in the vision, because frankly the unions have their own resources to bring to bear and could be very, very important strategic partners. Personally, and this is the view of Sophie, not the view of the Annie Casey Foundation, if any of you have been to SEC briefings. This is the view of Sophie. I'm not sure that we've made optimal use of the unions just yet, but as you know, it's a tough road, to travel.
I've got to get going, but just to say that I think you're absolutely right about the role of labor in California, and particularly in Los Angeles, it's the only metro area where private sector unionization is on the rise. And the reason is the labor movement has become very community friendly. The community sector sees the labor movement as an ally. That's been a bit of changes on both sides of the relationship, and it's led, I think, to really some pioneering work that's not just about community benefits agreements, but now it's increasingly about transforming entire sectors of the economy. So just passed in Los Angeles, for example, a few weeks ago, was a policy called Don't Waste LA, which is a policy of taking the private trucking firms that have been basically the way that they've moved trash from apartment buildings is this kind of free-for-all kind of competitive thing where the trucks go all over the city, so it's very polluting. It's very low road, and there's very few unionized firms that are doing it. So they've changed it to a zone system. It's going to improve trash collection, improve recycling, create the conditions for unionization, and actually shore up the businesses as well. And that was a community and labor-led effort. And those kind of creative things about forming alliances, too, with the environmental movement, it's happening in California. We hope that happens more and more across the United States.
We've come to the end of our time. I hope you join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you for joining our conversation.